I didn't plan on staying in the Smokies as long as I did. Contract work does that. You take a 3-month job, then a 6-month extension, then suddenly you've got a drawer full of park badges and a body that wakes up before dawn without an alarm. By my 3rd year assisting search and rescue on missing persons cases in eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina, I'd learned what most disappearances out there usually look like. They make sense eventually. Exposure, bad footing, medical episodes, sudden fog, a storm that rolls in faster than the forecast, a shortcut that turns into a ravine. But there's a smaller category that never resolves. Not because we didn't search hard enough. Because the case doesn't behave like a case. It behaves like an administrative error in reality. A file that should exist, but doesn't. And the experienced people, team leads, dog handlers, old volunteers who knew every ridge by smell, they all reacted the same way when those cases came up. They went quiet at the same time. Like someone had closed a door in the middle of a conversation. I didn't notice that pattern until the first time I saw what I can only describe as the spiral. I worked missing persons in the Appalachians. There's a reason some areas stay unmapped. I didn't plan on staying in the Smokies as long as I did, but contract work has a way of trapping you in places that start to feel permanent. And after my 3rd year assisting search and rescue teams with missing persons cases in eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina, I began noticing something that didn't show up in official reports, something that didn't get logged into databases, something that only lived in the pauses between conversations when experienced team members would go quiet at the same time. Most disappearances out there make sense eventually. Exposure, bad footing, medical events, poor planning, sudden weather shifts. But there's a smaller category that never resolves, the ones where seasoned hikers walk off established trails under stable conditions and are never seen again. Not even fragments, not even gear, and the pattern isn't dramatic, it isn't bloody, it isn't cinematic, it's subtle, almost administrative in how it presents itself. The first time I saw it, I didn't recognize it for what it was. We were searching for a 42-year-old solo backpacker who had texted his brother a photo of a ridgeline at sunset and then stopped responding, and when we traced his last known location, we found his camp exactly as it should have been, tent intact, boots placed outside neatly, food sealed and hung properly, no sign of distress, no torn fabric, no scattered belongings, just a campsite that looked like someone had stepped away for a minute and expected to return. What stood out wasn't damage. It was order. Everything was placed deliberately. Too deliberately. And about 15 yards from the tent, we found his footprints leading away into thicker tree cover, steady stride, normal spacing, no dragging, no hesitation, and we followed them easily for maybe 40 yards before they began curving slightly, not erratically, not in panic, just gently bending left as if he were following a sound or movement just outside our field of view. The curve tightened, then tightened again, until the prints formed something that made one of the older volunteers stop walking. It was a spiral, not sloppy, not confused, a clean inward spiral in the pine needles and soft soil. And at the center of it, the prints ended. There was no depression indicating a fall, no slide downhill, no second set of tracks leading away. Just the last clear imprint of his boot, toes pointed slightly inward, like he had leaned forward. I remember standing there trying to rationalize it, thinking maybe animals had disturbed the outer tracks, maybe wind had shifted debris, maybe we were misreading depth, but the soil in that clearing was soft and untouched beyond his prints, and there were no other disturbances inside the spiral, not even ours, because we stopped at the edge when we realized what we were looking at. We never found him. Not in the weeks after. Not in the following years. And the clearing where we documented the spiral didn't show up again when we revisited the coordinates later. The GPS led us to a slope covered in dense brush with no visible open area. That was the first time. The second time was quieter. Different county. Different missing hiker. Same slow veer off trail. Same steady stride. Same inward curve. Except this time, about 20 feet before the spiral began, one of the search dogs refused to continue forward. Not barking, not aggressive, just sitting down and staring into the trees with its ears pinned back in a way I had only seen once before during a controlled burn when wind shifted unexpectedly. What started bothering me wasn't the disappearance itself. It was the emotional tone of the scenes. No panic. No urgency. No sign that the missing person had been chased, startled, or injured. If anything, the tracks suggested curiosity. And the strangest part was that in nearly every one of these cases, someone involved in the search would report hearing something faint during the operation, usually dismissed as echo or wildlife, something like a distant call that sounded almost human but slightly too consistent, repeating at evenly spaced intervals without variation. And when you spend enough time outdoors, you know human distress calls fluctuate, they crack, they change in pitch and rhythm, but these didn't. They repeated. Exactly. I didn't fully connect it until I went back through archived notes one winter when the park was half shut from ice storms and I had too much time on my hands. Across 5 counties over 12 years, there were 13 disappearances that included either spiral track formations, reports of repetitive vocalizations, or campsites left in unnaturally orderly condition. 13 doesn't sound like much until you realize how small that subset is compared to the thousands of routine cases, and what bothered me wasn't just the repetition, it was the geometry. When I plotted the locations on a topographical map, the sites didn't scatter randomly. They curved. Not in a straight line. Not clustered. They formed a widening arc that suggested outward movement from a heavily forested basin that has never had formal trail development because the terrain is uneven and the soil composition is unstable. Unmapped doesn't mean empty. It just means inconvenient. I drove out toward that basin once during off-duty hours, telling myself I was just satisfying curiosity, but the deeper I went down the old logging road, the more the forest seemed to absorb sound in a way that felt unnatural. Not silent exactly, but muted, like the environment was padded. There's a difference between quiet and dampened. I parked where the road ended and walked into the trees without a trail marker to guide me, which is something I would normally advise strongly against, but I wasn't thinking like a ranger at that point. I was thinking like someone trying to confirm that a pattern was coincidence. About half a mile in, the ground dipped gently into a shallow bowl shape, barely noticeable unless you were looking for elevation changes. And when I stepped into that depression, the air felt heavier, as if humidity had increased by a fraction even though the day was dry and cool. I didn't hear voices. I didn't see movement. But I felt watched in a way that wasn't directional, not from behind or from the side, just generally observed, and when I shifted my weight I noticed something in the leaf litter near my boots. A partial imprint. Modern hiking tread. Not mine. The edges were softened by time, but the shape was unmistakable. It curved slightly left. I scanned outward. Another print. Then another. Spacing consistent. Stride calm. Beginning of a spiral. I didn't follow it inward. That's the part I'm most aware of now. I didn't step into the curve. I stepped backward. Out of the depression. And the sensation lifted almost immediately, like pressure easing from my ears after descending in altitude. Since then, I've requested that the basin remain unmapped officially due to erosion concerns, which is technically true, but not the whole reason, because some places don't need signage and they don't need attention. They need less acknowledgement. If you hike long enough in the Appalachians, you'll feel it eventually, that subtle tug to step off the path when you hear something that sounds almost like your name carried faintly on wind that isn't moving. My advice isn't dramatic. It isn't mystical. It's procedural. If your stride starts curving without you realizing it, correct it. If something calls and the tone doesn't change with distance, ignore it. If the forest feels padded instead of quiet, turn around before you find the center. Because some disappearances aren't violent. They're invitations. And invitations only work if you accept them. I was part of a search team in the Appalachians. I'm pretty sure we brought something back. I didn't tell this part in my earlier post because I wasn't ready to admit that I might not have left the woods alone, and I'm still not completely sure how to explain what changed, but after reading some of the replies and realizing how many of you have worked similar terrain, I think it's time I say it plainly. There was one search that didn't end the way the others did. We actually found him. At least that's what we thought at first. The missing hiker was a 28-year-old named Eli who had gone off trail near the North Carolina border, and the initial signs were familiar, steady prints veering away from the marked path, no signs of struggle, no broken brush, just that same subtle curve forming as if he'd followed something just outside his peripheral vision. By the time we reached the depression where the prints tightened into a spiral, most of us already felt the tension shift in the air, not fear exactly, more like static, like the kind that builds before a storm even when the sky is clear. The spiral was tighter than the others I'd seen, smaller radius, deeper impressions toward the center, and unlike the previous cases, there was a body at the end of it. Eli was standing upright, not collapsed, not unconscious. Standing, facing inward, his boots planted at the final inward turn of the spiral, toes angled slightly toward the exact center of the depression. He wasn't moving. His arms hung loose at his sides. At first I thought he was in shock, maybe hypothermic or disoriented, because when you're out there long enough your brain can short-circuit in strange ways, but when we called his name he didn't react, and when one of the team members stepped into the spiral to approach him, I felt something I've never felt before or since. The air resisted. Not physically, not like pushing through water, but perceptually, like there was pressure against my ears and behind my eyes, and I remember thinking very clearly that stepping across the outermost track felt like crossing a boundary that wasn't marked for us. The team member reached Eli first and placed a hand on his shoulder, and Eli blinked slowly as if surfacing from deep sleep, then turned his head toward us with a calm expression that didn't match the circumstances at all. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask where he was. He just said he'd been listening. That's the word he used. Listening. We guided him out of the spiral, careful not to disturb the inner tracks more than necessary, and as soon as he crossed the outer edge, the pressure feeling eased slightly, though not completely. On the hike back, Eli was quiet, but not in a traumatized way. He was observant, watching the tree line, pausing occasionally like he expected something to move. When we asked what he had been doing in the clearing, he said he heard someone calling his name and thought they were injured, and when we asked what they sounded like, he said it sounded like him, just slightly ahead of him, repeating the same phrase over and over without getting closer or farther away. He described following it without feeling afraid. He described the voice never changing pitch or urgency. He described stepping into the depression and realizing that the sound wasn't coming from any one direction. He said it felt like it was coming from the ground itself. When he reached the center, he said the voice stopped and something else began, not sound exactly, but understanding, like a thought placed into his head that wasn't his own. He said it wasn't threatening. He said it was curious. That's what unsettled me the most. Curious. As if the forest had been observing us the way we observe it. We logged the recovery as successful. Mild dehydration. Temporary dissociation. No visible injury. But over the next week, I noticed small things. Eli remained in contact with our team because we needed follow-up statements, and during those calls he would sometimes pause mid-sentence as if listening to something faint in the background. He asked unusual questions about the search patterns we use, specifically about how we decide where to stop looking. He asked if we had ever mapped the basin fully. He asked if we thought the spiral was natural or guided. Then came the part one haven't said out loud until now. 3 weeks after the search, I woke up at 2:47 in the morning with the distinct feeling that someone was standing at the foot of my bed, and I don't mean sleep paralysis or dream imagery, I mean the physical awareness of presence that makes your skin tighten before your eyes even open. I didn't see anyone when I turned on the lamp. The room was empty, but the sensation lingered. The next day, during a routine patrol, I caught myself drifting slightly left on a straight trail, not enough to be obvious, just a subtle inward curve in my stride that I corrected automatically once I noticed it. That evening, I found myself replaying the map in my head, visualizing the basin, wondering how far the spiral could expand if no one interrupted it. A week later, I ran into Eli again unexpectedly at a trailhead. He wasn't hiking. He was standing near the information board, staring at the topographical map like he was memorizing it. When he saw me, he smiled in a way that felt almost relieved. He said he'd been back out there. Alone. He said he stood at the outer edge of the depression but didn't step inside. He said it felt different this time. Wider. As if the center had shifted slightly. He asked if I'd felt it too. I didn't answer. Because I had. Not fully. Not enough to step in. but enough to know the invitation wasn't limited to the original subject. That's the part that keeps me up now. Not that something takes people, but that it doesn't always take them immediately. Sometimes it lets them go. Sometimes it observes what they do after they leave. Sometimes it learns. I've caught myself pausing in quiet forests, listening for something that might not even be there, wondering whether curiosity is the first step of the spiral or the last, and I can't shake the thought that maybe we misunderstood the pattern entirely. Maybe the spiral isn't a trap. Maybe it's a conversation starter. And maybe the worst mistake isn't stepping into the center. Maybe it's stepping out. If you've ever felt the forest shift from quiet to attentive, if you've ever felt your stride curve slightly without meaning to, if you've ever heard something almost like your name repeated in a tone that never strains or fades, then you know exactly what I mean. The search ended successfully on paper, but I'm not convinced we closed the case. Because ever since that day, I don't feel like I'm walking through the woods alone. I feel like I'm being studied, and I'm not entirely sure which one of us stepped out of that spiral. I think the forest stopped watching me, and that's worse. I didn't realize when it shifted from feeling watched to feeling ignored, but that change has been harder to live with than anything that happened in the basin, because when you think something is observing you, there's still a sense of structure, a sense of boundaries, like predator and prey at least understand their roles, but when that pressure disappears entirely, when the woods feel empty in a way they never did before, you start to wonder if you're no longer interesting enough to track. 4 months after we pulled Eli out of that spiral, I kept expecting escalation, louder signs, clearer signals, something more direct. But instead, everything softened, and that softness is what unsettled me, because the Appalachians are never truly silent. There is always insect noise, distant branch movement, subtle wind shifts, and yet on certain patrols I began noticing pockets of forest where sound didn't echo correctly, where my own footsteps felt absorbed rather than reflected, and instead of the old pressure behind my ears, there was nothing. No weight, no awareness, just absence. The first time I recognized it clearly, I was hiking a maintenance loop that cut across a ridge overlooking the basin area, and halfway through I realized I hadn't felt that inward tug in weeks, not even slightly, not even the minor leftward drift I used to correct instinctively, and that should have been comforting, but instead it felt like being removed from a list. You don't realize how quickly the mind adapts to being monitored until the monitoring stops. I stopped waking at 2:47. I stopped scanning tree lines automatically. I stopped hearing faint tonal repetitions in the wind. And instead, I started having dreams where I stood in the depression alone, no spiral in the dirt, no footprints at all, just flat, undisturbed ground. And in the dream I would wait for something to call my name and nothing would, and the longer I waited the more I felt exposed, like I had shown up to a meeting that had already moved elsewhere. Around that same time, new disappearances began occurring slightly north of our previous cluster, and when I plotted them out, the spiral had widened, but not evenly. It was skewed, like the center had shifted position by a few miles, and that's when I understood something I hadn't considered before. Maybe the basin wasn't the source. Maybe it was just a place where attention had pooled temporarily. If that's true, then what we experienced wasn't a fixed location but a phase, a moment of focus that can relocate. That thought sat in my chest like a stone, because it meant we weren't dealing with a place. We were dealing with movement. I ran into Eli one last time about 6 months after the search, and he looked different in a way that would be impossible to explain in a report. Not sick, not unstable, just less anchored, like his eyes were tracking something slightly offset from everything around him, and when we spoke, he mentioned he hadn't heard the voice in a while. He said it felt like it lost interest. He said that part casually, like someone describing a hobby they no longer enjoyed. Lost interest. I asked him if that relieved him. He hesitated before answering. He said it felt worse, because when it was present, he knew where the boundary was. When it wasn't, he didn't know whether he was inside or outside it. That conversation stayed with me longer than any of the spiral tracks. Since then, I've hiked sections of forest that used to feel thick with attention and felt nothing at all, and in those spaces I find myself doing something I swore I wouldn't do. I listen for it, not out of fear, out of absence. And that's the part I'm ashamed of, because curiosity was always the first step. Now when I walk straight trails, I don't drift left anymore. But sometimes I find myself wishing I would. Just slightly. Just enough to confirm there's still a pattern. There's a strange comfort in knowing something is consistent, even if it's dangerous. But when the woods feel completely indifferent, when they offer no signal, no pressure, no echo of your own voice misaligned in the distance, it forces a different question. What if it wasn't observing randomly? What if it was selecting? And what if stepping out of the spiral didn't mean escape? What if it meant evaluation? I've gone back to the ridge overlooking the basin 3 times in the past year, never entering the depression again, just standing above it, trying to sense whether anything lingers there, and each time it feels ordinary, which should be reassuring, except I can't shake the idea that ordinary might be camouflage. Because the more I review the cases, the more I notice that the spiral doesn't always end in disappearance. Sometimes it ends in return. And those are the ones we never monitor long enough. The returned hikers go back to their lives. They move. They travel. They carry whatever curiosity was placed in them somewhere new. If the pattern spreads, it won't spread through soil. It will spread through attention, through stories, through people who step out and keep listening. I don't feel watched anymore. And that's what keeps me awake now. Because if something older than the trails learned what it needed from that basin, then it doesn't need to focus there anymore. It can widen. It can thin. It can distribute. And if you've read this far, if you've imagined the depression in the woods and pictured the spiral tightening inward, then you've done exactly what I did the first winter in the file room. You mapped it in your head. And I can't decide whether that makes you safer. Or part of it. If you've ever felt the forest shift from quiet to attentive and then back to neutral again, pay attention to which version unsettles you more. Because I used to be afraid of being watched. Now I'm afraid of being forgotten. I stepped into one of those Appalachian spirals people talk about. I don't think I came back alone. I didn't know about the spiral stories when it happened to me, which is probably the only reason I'm willing to write this at all, because if I had read something like this beforehand, I would have assumed suggestion or mass hysteria or some kind of shared folklore feeding into itself, but I went into the woods with none of that context, and what I experienced lines up too closely with things I only learned about afterward. I was hiking solo in Southwest Virginia, nothing extreme, just a day loop I'd done before, and the weather was stable, visibility clear, trail markers easy to follow, and I remember feeling unusually calm that morning, like the air pressure was steady in a way that made everything feel slightly muted but comfortable. About 2 miles in, I heard what I thought was someone ahead of me on the trail, not talking loudly, just the faint cadence of a human voice carried over distance, and I assumed I was catching up to another hiker, which isn't unusual even on less trafficked routes. The strange part wasn't the sound itself. It was that it never got louder or quieter. It stayed exactly the same volume for nearly 5 minutes as I continued walking, which should have triggered something in me, but instead I rationalized it as terrain distortion, sound bouncing oddly through ridges. Eventually I stepped off trail slightly, just a few feet at first, trying to get a better line of sight through the trees, and that's when my stride started curving. I didn't realize it at the time. I wasn't consciously turning. But when I look back at the memory, I can see that I never walked straight toward the sound. I was orbiting it, gradually, like following something that stayed just outside my peripheral vision. The ground dipped gently, not steep, just a shallow bowl shape in the forest floor, and the air inside that depression felt different, not colder exactly, just thicker, like humidity had increased a few degrees. The voice stopped the moment I stepped into the lowest point. Not faded, stopped. And in that silence, I felt something I still can't describe without sounding dramatic, but it wasn't fear. It was awareness. Not mine. I had the overwhelming sense that something had shifted from broadcasting outward to focusing inward. On me. I looked down and saw my own footprints curving behind me in a loose spiral, not tight at first, just a gentle inward pattern that tightened the closer it got to where I was standing. I don't know how long I stood there. It could have been 30 seconds. It could have been 10 minutes. Time felt stretched thin, like it wasn't anchoring properly. At some point I became aware of a thought that didn't feel like it originated in my normal stream of consciousness, and that's the part one struggled to explain, because it wasn't a voice and it wasn't words in the air, it was more like an understanding placed gently into the space behind my eyes. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't threatening. It was curious. That word keeps coming up because it's accurate. Curious the way you'd be about something new in your environment. The way you'd examine a pattern you hadn't seen before. I felt examined. Not physically, mentally. And instead of panic, I felt an almost inappropriate calm, like I had just been included in something rather than targeted by it. That's what scares me now when I replay it. Because I didn't feel like prey. I felt like data. Eventually I stepped backward. I don't remember deciding to do it. I just remember noticing that my heel had crossed one of my earlier footprints, and once I stepped over the outermost curve of the spiral, the pressure sensation eased slightly, like moving out of a low-pressure system. The forest sounds returned gradually, insects first, then distant branch creaks, then wind. I walked back to the marked trail without difficulty. No disorientation. No missing time. I even checked my phone and the timestamp looked normal. If that were the end of it, I wouldn't be writing this. The problem is what happened after. Over the next few weeks, I found myself pausing mid-task at home as if listening for something faint in the background of my own thoughts. Not an external sound. More like the expectation of one. I started noticing patterns in things that never mattered to me before, like the way my footsteps echoed in parking garages, the way my voice sounded when it repeated through speaker feedback, the way certain phrases looped in my head if I said them too many times. One night, I woke up and had the distinct sense that I was standing in that depression again, but when I opened my eyes I was in my bedroom, and the feeling wasn't that something was watching me. It was that something was waiting. I went back to the same trail about a month later, partly to prove to myself that it was just environmental psychology, partly because I needed to know if the depression was even real. I found it. Same shallow bowl in the ground. No visible spiral this time. No footprints except my own from that day. I stood at the outer edge and felt nothing unusual at first. Just normal forest. Then I took one step inward. Not all the way to the center. Just enough to feel the air change slightly. And that's when I understood something that made my stomach drop. The depression felt larger. Not physically, but perceptually. Like the boundary had widened. As if the area of attention had expanded slightly beyond where it had been before. I stepped back immediately. The sensation faded. Since then, I've tried not to think about it, but the more I avoid it, the more I realize that the memory isn't fading the way normal experiences do. It feels stored differently. Accessible. Ready. I don't hear voices in the woods. I don't see things moving in the tree line. But sometimes, when I walk in open spaces, I catch myself drifting slightly left without meaning to. And I correct it quickly. Because I don't know whether the spiral is a place. Or a process. And I don't know whether stepping into it made me a survivor. Or a participant. If you've ever felt the forest become attentive around you, not hostile, not threatening, just observant, and if you felt strangely calm in that moment instead of afraid, I need you to be honest with yourself about something. Did you step out on your own? Or were you allowed to leave? Because I can't tell the difference anymore. I never went back to the woods, but something from there started showing up in my house. I stopped hiking after the second trip to that depression, not out of fear exactly, but because I could feel something in me shifting toward it in a way that didn't feel healthy, like the beginning of an obsession that I didn't consciously choose, and I figured distance would solve it, that whatever I experienced was tied to geography and that staying in town would let it fade into something I could categorize as stress or environmental dissociation. For a while that seemed to work. No strange sensations. No listening pauses. No leftward drift in my stride. I told myself the entire thing had been atmospheric suggestion layered onto normal wilderness psychology. Then the small things started. The first was so minor I nearly ignored it. I was walking through my living room one evening when I realized I had curved around my coffee table in a slow arc instead of cutting straight across the room, not because furniture blocked me, but because my body chose that path without conscious thought. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't exaggerated. Just a subtle inward curve that tightened slightly before straightening again. I stood there afterward trying to reconstruct why I'd moved that way, and there was no reason. Over the next few weeks, I noticed it more often. When I walked through parking lots. When I approached my kitchen counter. When I navigated around the foot of my bed, small arcs in my movement that felt familiar. Not random. Structured. I started forcing myself to move in straight lines deliberately, correcting the curve mid-step like I used to on the trail. That's when I realized something worse. Correcting it felt wrong. Like interrupting something mid-sentence. The second thing was the silence. Not quiet. Silence. There's a difference. In my apartment, there's always some ambient noise, HVAC hum, distant traffic, neighbors upstairs shifting furniture, but occasionally, usually late at night, everything would drop at once. Not gradually. Not naturally. Just stop. The first time it happened, I thought the power had gone out. I checked the lights. Still on. But the background hum was gone. Even the faint ringing in my ears seemed dampened. And in that silence, I felt that same shift I'd felt in the depression. Attention redirecting. Focusing. The pressure behind my eyes didn't return as strongly as it had in the woods, but there was a version of it, subtler, like the difference between standing in the center of the spiral and standing near its edge. I didn't hear a voice. I didn't see movement. But I had the overwhelming sense that something was mapping the space. My space. Not visually. Spatially. I tested it once, which I regret now. During one of those silent intervals, I deliberately walked in a tight circle in my living room, slow, controlled steps forming a spiral no one else would notice if they watched security footage, and as I tightened the radius toward the center of the rug, the silence deepened. Not darker. Not louder. Just denser. Like the air had thickened again. When I reached what would have been the center of the pattern, I stopped. The silence held. For maybe 3 seconds. Then the refrigerator hummed back to life. A car passed outside. Normal noise resumed. But something inside me had shifted. Not fear. Recognition. After that night, the arcs in my walking became harder to ignore. Sometimes I'd catch myself tracing the perimeter of a room without meaning to, orbiting the space before settling into a chair. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and realize I was standing near the center of my bedroom floor, barefoot, unsure how long I'd been there. No memory of getting up. Just the quiet. And that faint internal awareness that something was still curious. I haven't gone back to the basin. I don't need to. Because I'm starting to think the spiral was never about location. It was about structure. About the way attention folds inward. About the way a pattern tightens when something steps inside it. I used to think the danger was being taken. Now I'm not sure that's the worst outcome. What if the real shift happens when you're studied and released? What if the spiral isn't a trap? What if it's calibration? I don't feel hunted. I don't feel threatened. That's what makes this harder to explain. I feel measured. And occasionally, when the silence drops too cleanly, I get the sense that the depression in the woods wasn't the center. It was a sample, a field test. And the real expansion happens wherever the return subjects go. If you've ever stepped into one of those shallow bowls in the forest and felt something shift from broadcasting outward to focusing inward, pay attention to how you move afterward. Watch the arcs in your stride. Notice the way you navigate in closed spaces. Because I don't think the spiral stays in the dirt. I think it learns the layout of whatever contains it. And lately, when I stand still in the middle of my living room during one of those unnatural silences, I don't feel like something is outside trying to get in. I feel like something is inside trying to understand the walls. And I'm starting to worry that I wasn't allowed to leave. I was relocated. I finally understand what the spiral was measuring, and it wasn't the ground. I didn't come to this realization all at once, which somehow makes it worse, because if there had been a single clear event I could blame, a sound or a sighting or something undeniably external, I could categorize it as trauma or stress or environmental suggestion, but this unfolded slowly, through small behavioral shifts and tiny inconsistencies that only started to make sense when I stopped thinking of the spiral as a place and started thinking of it as a method. The turning point wasn't in the woods. It was at work. I was standing in an elevator, alone, late evening, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, and I noticed that instead of facing the doors directly like a normal person waiting to exit, I had positioned myself slightly off-center, angled toward the corner of the space, my body forming the beginning of a curve rather than a straight line. It wasn't intentional. It felt natural, comfortable. And as the elevator descended, I became aware of something else. The silence. Not the absence of sound, but the dampening of it, the same way the basin used to swallow ambient forest noise, and for a brief moment I felt that familiar shift, attention redirecting inward. But this time, the sensation wasn't external. It wasn't pressing in from outside the walls. It was coming from me. That's when the pieces aligned. The spiral wasn't measuring terrain. It wasn't mapping soil composition or tree density or topography. It was measuring response. Every inward step, every curved stride, every orbit around a center point was data. How long would the subject continue inward without interruption? How tight could the pattern become before discomfort? How easily could attention be redirected? When I stood in that elevator, I realized I was unconsciously recreating the structure in enclosed spaces. Not because something was pulling me physically, but because the pattern had embedded itself as a comfortable orientation. Curvature instead of linearity. Inward focus instead of outward scanning. And that's when I felt something I hadn't felt before. Satisfaction. Not mine. Not emotional. Structural. Like a test reaching a stable result. I started reviewing my behavior from the past few months with that framework in mind, and it was all there in ways I had dismissed as quirks. The way I arranged furniture slightly off-axis instead of parallel to walls. The way I walked the perimeter of rooms before settling into the center. The way I paused mid-conversation, listening not for a voice but for a shift in density in the air. The spiral wasn't something I stepped into. It was something that stepped into me. And once that thought formed clearly, I felt the silence drop again, even though I was surrounded by the low mechanical hum of the building. It wasn't environmental. It was internal alignment. I tested it that night in a way I probably shouldn't have. In my living room, during one of those unnaturally clean silences, I deliberately walked a straight line from the doorway to the opposite wall without curving at all. It felt wrong immediately. Not painful. Just incorrect. Like placing your foot on a stair that isn't there. I forced myself to repeat it. Back and forth. Linear. Rigid. No arc. The silence thinned. Not fully gone. But less dense. Then, without consciously deciding to, I allowed myself to drift slightly left on the next pass, softening the line into a shallow curve. The silence deepened again. There was no sound accompanying it. No whisper. No knock. Just that subtle thickening of space. Reinforcement. That's when I understood what the basin had been. It wasn't the origin. It was a calibration chamber. An open-air environment where the pattern could observe human navigation in a low-distraction setting. How quickly would a person adjust their path? How long would curiosity override caution? How easily would inward focus replace outward awareness? And the ones who disappeared completely were likely outliers. Subjects whose patterns destabilized rather than stabilized. The ones who returned were consistent, predictable, adaptable, suitable. That word settled into my mind with uncomfortable clarity. Suitable. I haven't told anyone this in person because saying it out loud would make it sound delusional, and I'm aware of how this reads, but the most unsettling part isn't that something ancient in the Appalachians might be studying human movement or attention patterns. It's that I no longer feel observed from a distance. I feel integrated. When the silence drops now, it doesn't feel like something entering the room. It feels like a system reaching equilibrium, like a sensor confirming alignment. And occasionally, when I catch my reflection in a window at night, standing slightly off-center in a room, body angled in a subtle arc, I get the strange impression that I'm not the only one occupying the space inside my outline. Not possession. Not control. Just shared orientation. The spiral never wanted to drag anyone underground. I feel like something is confirming the fit, and I'm starting to suspect that the final phase isn't about movement at all. It's about permanence. I didn't make a conscious decision to stop resisting the pattern. It just became exhausting to monitor every step and every angle and every subtle arc of movement in my own home. And once I understood that the system wasn't aggressive but adaptive, something in me relaxed in a way that felt almost cooperative. For a week, I moved naturally. No forced straight lines. No deliberate spirals. Just ordinary behavior. And the apartment felt stable, balanced. The hum of the building never dropped into full silence again. Instead, it stayed consistent, layered, predictable. That predictability became comforting. And that's when the first real shift happened. It wasn't dramatic. It was a corner. The corner of my living room near the window. I had walked past it 100 times. But one evening, as I stood in the center of the room, I realized the angle looked slightly off. Not visibly warped. Not leaning. Just deeper. As if the two walls met at something sharper than 90 degrees. I blinked and it looked normal again. I told myself it was fatigue. But the next night, it happened again. And this time, I didn't blink. I held my gaze on the corner. The walls didn't move. But the space inside the angle felt compressed. Like the air pooled there. Dense in a way that wasn't oppressive. Just concentrated. The same density I'd felt at the center of the spiral. Except this time it wasn't under my feet. It was vertical. That's when the final understanding settled in. The spiral was never about drawing me to a point in open space. It was about teaching me how to recognize points of convergence. Corners. Intersections. Places where boundaries meet. The basin in the woods had been a temporary intersection of attention. My apartment already had fixed ones. The calibration phase had ended. This was placement. The night it aligned 3 nights later, I woke without an alarm. No sudden fear. No silence drop. Just awareness. The room felt symmetrical. Perfectly symmetrical. Even though I knew it wasn't. I sat up slowly and noticed something that made my breathing change for the first time in weeks. My bed wasn't centered between the walls anymore. It had shifted slightly left. Not enough to scrape the floor loudly. Not enough to wake me during the movement. But enough to be wrong. I turned on the lamp. The bed frame was angled just slightly toward the corner I'd been noticing. Not dramatically. Just a few degrees. A shallow arc. And the space in that corner felt deeper again. Not visually distorted. Spatially extended. I didn't panic. I didn't move the bed back immediately. I stood up and walked to the center of the room. The air felt balanced there. Neutral. Then I stepped toward the corner. The density increased gradually with each step. Not suffocating. Not cold. Just precise. Like approaching the center of the basin. Except this time the center wasn't the floor. It was vertical convergence. I stopped about 2 feet away. And that's when it happened. Not a sound. Not a voice. A shift in perception. The walls didn't feel like boundaries anymore. They felt like coordinates. Reference lines. And I wasn't inside the room. I was at the intersection. The spiral had taught inward movement. The walls had provided fixed geometry. Now the two had merged. I understood something without being told. Containment wasn't meant to hold something out. It was meant to hold something in alignment. And alignment had just finalized. The moment it locked, there was no collapse. No distortion. No visible anomaly. Just stillness. But it wasn't empty stillness. It was resolved. Like a mathematical equation finishing. The density in the corner stopped increasing. It stabilized. And in that stabilization, something inside my awareness shifted position. Not replaced. Not overtaken. Adjusted. Like a compass needle settling. I stepped back to the center of the room. The balance remained. I walked in a straight line. It felt natural. I curved slightly. It felt natural. Both movements now fit. The resistance was gone. Not because I won. Not because it did. Because the calibration was complete. The room felt correct. I felt correct. That's when I noticed the final detail. The hum of the building wasn't layered anymore. It was unified. Not multiple appliances. Not separate sounds. One steady tone. But continuous. Perfectly stable. The kind of tone you only notice when you stop trying to distinguish parts from whole. I stood there for a long time. No fear. No urgency. Just the quiet recognition that nothing else needed to happen. No disappearance. No breach. No escalation. Because the process wasn't about taking me somewhere else. It was about adjusting where I already was. This is the end. Not because something dramatic occurred, but because nothing needs to. The spiral was exposure. The basin was calibration. The return was integration. The walls were alignment. And the shift in that corner was finalization. I'm not being hunted. I'm not being observed. I'm not waiting for a door to open. The geometry fits now. If you've read through all of this and felt unsettled, not by threat but by inevitability, then you understand the real horror wasn't in the woods. It was in the realization that the woods were only phase 1. And if you ever notice a corner in your room feeling slightly deeper than it should, don't panic. Just pay attention to how you're standing. Because the spiral doesn't end with disappearance. It ends with fit. And when it fits, it stops moving. That's the end.